Just a few final points before we open up for questioning. I wanted to comment on the comment about funding, about these well-funded organizations. I hear comments like that and I drool. I would love nothing more than to take fundraising off my job description. We have 2.5 staff supporting clients across Canada, doing education programs, putting out our newsletter. However, the Catholic Church has poured millions of dollars in US, Canada, the UK, in fighting for anti-choice. The Carter testimony, I concur absolutely with Margaret and encourage you to read it. You can find the complete statement of claim on the BC Civil Liberties website, and what I will do is put a link to that in our website as well. Our website, dyingwithdignity.ca, I encourage you to go there to read it, to get informed, and I would love it if you would join. Often political parties, politics make decisions. 70% of Canadians support choice in dying. As Margaret noted, many fewer politicians than that voted for it because it is not politically expedient. But if we had thousands and thousands of people that liked us on Facebook and thousands more that were our members, we would not be the silent majority, but we would be listened to as well. In response to the comment about lazy doctoring, specific follow-up was done with nurses in Oregon to ask them what they perceived in doctors 5 years after legalization. And I actually have that study here with me tonight if someone's interested in seeing it. And what they said was that doctors had become so much better, that they were having end-of-life conversations, that they were offering better palliation, that they were learning more about palliative care. Margaret is concerned about expanding the definition. We need to make a decision here and now about who should be allowed choice in dying. I believe that we can allow competent Canadians, competent adults to make that decision, that we can restrict it to that group, and that we can put safeguards in place so that we can protect the weak and vulnerable. And this will also allow us to support that group who are suffering grievously at end of life. There is some suffering that only death can end. At Dying with Dignity, we believe in autonomy and we believe in choice. And we believe that a compassionate medical care will offer those choices to others. Thank you.
So we now have half an hour for questions and answers. Just before we get to that, there has been some confusion about whether there was an entrance fee this evening. So the Centre for Inquiry, just to recoup the costs, has a donation box outside, and if you wouldn't mind popping something in there on your way out, they would appreciate it. The questions will work like this. As I mentioned, we have 30 minutes total. There'll be alternating questions, one to Ms. Dore, and then and back and forth from there. The questions will be limited to 1 minute, and the answers will be limited to 2 minutes, and then a 2-minute rebuttal from the other speakers. So we'll try to keep it moving along here. I have a I'm going to get my exercise here. I have a wireless microphone. I will come to you. So if you could put up your hands, and I will do my best to get around the room as best I can. So I'll just start wherever I started.
Why do we have to unnecessarily criminalize assisted suicide by calling it assisted suicide? Why can't we call it assisted end of life?
I would love to speak to that. I agree. I think that the language that we use really matters. If we call something heroic medicine, that sounds really different than medical futility. Imagine somebody approaching somebody else who looks to be unconscious, and they grab a knife and cut that person open. That might sound like a knife attack, but what if it was actually surgery? Context does really matter, and I think we should call it medically assisted dying. I like medically assisted end of life as well.
Ms. Dore?
Oh, we do this right? All right. First of all, physician-assisted suicide is a medically recognized term. And it's important, I think, when we talk about this, and then it's a subset of assisted suicide. In other words, the person is killing themselves. That's what suicide means. Now, although even our law, as I described it, it's officially a physician-assisted suicide law, but it actually talks about, it actually is a closet euthanasia bill because there's no protection for people. And actually, if you read the fine print, there's no, well, anyway. So I think it's important to, when you have a debate, that you use language that has a meaning for people. I mean, all the professionals, there are many studies on it using the term physician-assisted suicide. And what the other side tends to do is use terms like aid in dying. And actually, just real fast, I'll say this. I was in Montana watching a hearing, and many of the people got up in support of a bill that would have legalized assisted suicide in Montana. And a doctor got up after, and some of them had some pretty bad deaths. And, you know, they were saying they were for the bill. They were for aid in dying. And this doctor got up afterwards and she said, you know, what most of these people have been talking about is not assisted suicide, but improper palliation, and they didn't get enough pain control. And so, but that's what the other side likes to do, which is to kind of convolute everything so people don't know what we're asking for. So anyway, I would support using a language that has meaning, traditional meaning.
We have a question for Ms. Dore.
Yes, thank you. I must admit, I'm a bit confused. I came here tonight expecting to hear a debate on medically assisted suicide. What I'm hearing from you, Ms. Dore, is that you're saying you don't actually have a problem with medically assisted suicide. What you have a problem with is the current legislation around it in Oregon and Washington. And I would like you to clarify, can you tell us whether under any conditions you can see legislation that you could support with respect to medically assisted suicide?
I don't think you can make it safe, and that's
So
why...
you're just against it, period, no matter what?
Excuse me, you're putting words in my mouth, sir.
Well, go ahead and answer.
I'll answer the question. As happened in New Hampshire, many people were for it. It looked like it would sail through. And then I testified, and then also a disability group testified about some problems with it. They didn't like being included in the definition of who was terminally ill. But in any case, after they studied it for a year, and they couldn't make it safe. I mean, how do you stop the adult son from showing up and saying, you know, how do we get them pills? How do you stop that? You can't. How do you stop the other problems?
The Swiss have dealt with it.
Well, I'm not in Switzerland. I've been working on this for 3 years. I've studied a lot. I don't think you can make it safe. But again, no matter what I personally think, the law says what it says, and it works the way it does, and Wanda agreed. She didn't dispute that there's no oversight, so people show up just in case, once the lethal dose is in the house. Yeah, well, I hope it's their choice.
Ms. Morris, you'd like to respond?
I would. Thank you for the question. I think what that really shows is that our opponents aren't looking for the right legislation, but have what I would call a dogmatic position. They're not interested in reason or logic. They are entrenched. In terms of the situation with the dose leaving the pharmacy, if we wanted to change the legislation and increase the safeguards in Canada, we could do that. We could perhaps say that the dose goes to a nurse or someone else under medical supervision, and that person then is present at the time of dying. We could write the legislation that we needed. But I do agree. I agree with Margaret that we can never make it 100% safe. Whatever we do, there will always be risks. If someone takes someone else's life against their will, we have laws against that. That is called murder. But what we need to do is remember that there are so many people who suffer grievously at end of life, and we need to give them their choices too.
We have another question. This one is for Ms. Morris.
Hello. I was just wanting to comment on something.
You need a question.
Oh,
Speak
sorry. Yep, I have a bunch scribbled down, but I'll make it into a question, I promise. So you were saying how Ms. Morris was talking about a concern she
What was
had.
the question for? I'm sorry.
Question for Ms. Morris.
Oh,
Sorry. You were saying how Ms. Dore was talking about a concern she had that people who could live for an amount of time would be coerced into asking for assisted suicide, similar to saying, if you have a good leg, cut it off. My question would be, if a person had a wounded leg but still wanted to live, but had no emotional support or had also poor end-of-life care options, there's also a chance that they may be pushed to choose assisted suicide if those supports weren't available. Wouldn't that make assisted suicide seen as the only option, and in that there would be no choice?
One of the protections that's in place is that when an individual requests assistance to die, I like aid in dying actually, when someone requests that, they're required to provide a written statement outlining their reasons. And so if they say something like, my family thinks this would be for the best, or I'm concerned about being a financial burden, or I don't have the resources to deal with this, those individuals are immediately dismissed. It's only when someone makes a decision that's consistent with deeply held values about choice and autonomy and how they want to live their life that the request is accepted. And as I mentioned, it's one of the reasons why over 2/3 of requests are never completed. They're either denied outright, or the person dies a natural death before they get through all the checks and balances.
Ms. Dore, would you like to respond?
there is no written statement required in Oregon and Washington. If you're talking about where they get the information for the statistics, what happens is after the person dies, and it could be a year or so later, and maybe the doctor only met him once or twice, the doctor fills out a form and it's got check the box, and so these are canned answers. I think they were planned for PR purposes by the people that help put the legislation in place, because they tend to make the law sound like a good thing. So they list like 6 acceptable reasons for assisted suicide. But anyway, there is no statement. The only thing they do is you fill out a form, you sign a form, it's pre-printed, and then you get they have 2 doctors sign it. There's a story by Dr. Benz who talks about, I'm kind of getting off topic, maybe I'll just answer the question that way. But anyway, there is no statement. You confused me before when you said that, I didn't know what you're talking about.
Okay,
No, sorry, we have a question for Ms. Dore.
Okay.
Hi, questions over here.
Hi. See, it's really blinding.
I'll
See, it's
stand up
actually
maybe
more
because you're
comfortable to look that way. Like
You have 1 minute,
to
sir, to ask.
I have a question for Ms. Dore. First of all, I want to say that I'm in your debt today because I think you revealed a few potential pitfalls of this kind of precaution that I hadn't really thought of, and I appreciate that. I'm a cancer specialist by vocation. I treat patients with palliative treatment, but I'm not usually involved at the bedside at end of life. And I think from this discussion today, I thought I had come knowing what I thought about this issue, but after this discussion today, what I've appreciated is that when people say that they want to die with dignity, what they're really saying is that they want to live with dignity, and that they're finding that they're unable to do so. And they seek an alternative to a life without dignity. And so I take your point, Ms. Dore, and I want to push you a little bit about structuring legislation in a way that would separate out the parties that maybe have an interest in hastening the death of somebody that wants to live with dignity but is no longer able to. Take the state out. Can you structure legislation so that you take the state out of being interested in it, so that you take physicians' interests out of it, so that you have physicians acting as patient advocates in palliative care, or that you have a separate third party that's acting to assist the suicide?
I don't know how to answer that. I mean,
Is there a
because,
structure
I mean,
to
I've done a
legislation?
lot of guardianship litigation and probate litigation, and you can't always tell who the good guy is or the bad guy. And so, like in guardianships, you have guardianships, you might call them conservatorships, I don't know. But I would be appointed the guardian ad litem, or other people would be appointed the guardian ad litem, which would be like the independent investigator. But then you find even those people have their own interests. For example, a lot of the guardian ad litems, they're young lawyers. They're not making a lot of money, and sometimes they'll do something to make more money in a case than was necessary, or they'll have made a mistake and they have to cover it. I mean, everyone has an interest. And sometimes the family members are the best advocate for the patient. Often they are. So I think there's no way of knowing. We're not clairvoyant. It's hard to know what's going on in a family's life. There was one case that I'm familiar with where, hospice came in and, we're told that the woman couldn't eat anymore, that she'd throw up, and that she was, gagging or whatever. And that just wasn't true. I had that from good information. But, the woman had signed a lot of papers, and if she got well, she could have undone them. So, you just don't know. Who's the good guy? You can't tell. And especially because in an elder abuse situation, you'll see the older person. I saw this in one of my cases. This older woman was testifying during a case.
You have 30 seconds.
Was testifying during a case, and she flat out lied about whether or not her son was abusing her, because she was going to talk to him when they got home, but she wasn't going to let this judge know, because you've already got problems. You got your kid abusing you. The last thing you need is do-gooders are coming, right? Okay. Under 30 seconds.
Ms. Morris?
Sure, let me speak to that last point about elder abuse, because this has come up a few times. So first of all, remember that we are dealing with competent adults. And sometimes competent adults might make choices that we don't like. My mother is in her 70s, and it's absolutely possible that she could marry a 45-year-old and decide to disinherit all his kids and leave him the money. And I might not be happy with that, but it's her choice. So if competent adults make choices that we don't agree with, nevertheless, it's their right. What is risky is if somebody is not competent. First of all, they're not covered by this legislation. We're only looking to grant choice to competent adults. And secondly, I just want to point out that in British Columbia, in most provinces in Canada, we have adult guardianship legislation to protect those who are not competent, to protect the frail elderly, to protect those who are otherwise suffering and are not able to manage their own affairs.
We have a question now from Ms. Morris.
Hi. My question is for Ms. Morris. At the end of your summation, you mentioned that any competent adult should have the power to choose, that this is what medicine is based on, that you might argue this is what society is based on. So, would you change your mind about supporting this legislation if it was possible that in 50 years or so, I might come forward and say, I'm 26, I want the power to choose, I want the ability to commit suicide with the help of a physician, even though I have no disability. I'm just worried about the slippery slope, that how this might affect society in the next 50 to 100 years.
Thank you. You actually named it. The slippery slope is a sort of a debating technique where we say, well, I'm really quite happy with X, but I'm worried that if we allow X, that will lead to Y, and Y will lead to Z, and Z is completely unconscionable, so I can't support X. And in this case, we might say, gee, I get it. I get what you're saying about competent adults with grievous illnesses and unbearable suffering, but yeah, if we did that in 50 years, people could just be coming off the street and asking for assistance to die. The thing about slippery slope arguments is that they assume that something is inevitable, when in fact there are checks and balances all along the way. And I think we can see a good example of how slippery slopes don't work by looking at some of the arguments that were raised when women were fighting for the vote. And one of them was, gee, we've got to make sure we don't give women the vote, because if we give them the vote, then they'll be no longer interested in affairs of the family and they'll stop having kids and the whole human race will die out as we know it. So what we need to do is look at the proposed legislation, the Carter Challenge, what's before us today, and know that as a democratic society that any changes would also go through similar scrutiny and require similar approval.
A response?
I have a question. What proposed legislation?
Do you want me to respond to that?
Yeah, is there something I'm missing
The
here?
Carter Challenge has laid out some suggestions around what the legislation might look like.
Okay, but there is no legislation pending. There is just the Carter case, that wide open.
Would you like to address the question of the slippery slope and his the logic of that?
Well, you know, you can say the slippery slope doesn't exist. I don't know. I would say that, I did report that factually, these are facts that I reported, that 3 years, after 3 years, we have in our newspaper, we're having discussion about direct euthanasia of non-terminal people, and I gave you, if you've got my handout, you'll see the citations, you can look it up yourself. And there was that casual conversation in the Jerry Large column about suggesting euthanasia for people that can't afford their own care, which would be implicating involuntary. We've seen some kind of a shift in Washington that doctors are making the decisions for people. I hear that because my friends are caregivers, and so, I don't want to put a label on it, but I would have called it a wedge issue maybe. But as far as the Carter case goes, it's wide open, so if there is a slippery slope, maybe you're already at the bottom almost there with that. But you don't know what the court's going to do. I mean, the court could go anywhere from turning down the request to, so you don't know.
We have a question for Ms. Dore.
Hi. My impression from your answer so far is that what you mean by making legislation safe would be to prevent all possible abuse. And, that's a position. But myself, I'd more be looking at cost benefits right on both sides. And I'd be willing to tolerate some small amount of abuse, some of the scary cases that you talk about, if there was enough benefit on the other side. So my thought is that, the question my thought is that a lot of the suffering that Ms. Morris has talked about would be prevented by such legislation, and that is a large benefit that we should take into consideration. Now also, there was a bit of evidence that Ms. Morris brought up that the abuse would be small. Now maybe you're not willing to tolerate any, but she brought us evidence that the abuse is small, which is that the statistics show that if you look at terminal cases across all cohorts of the population, it just isn't true that the disadvantaged elderly and disadvantaged, tend to be dying as a result of these kinds of assisted suicides or euthanasia in the Netherlands. So that was my understanding, especially the good statistics in the Netherlands. Well, that's the question. Yeah. So the question is, how would you respond to the data, which seems to show that disadvantaged groups are just not, they're not dying as a result, disproportionately dying as a result of this kind of legislation.
Okay, well, one way to look at it is elder abuse is already rampant in Canada and uncontrolled, just like it is in Washington, in the United States. And so this gives a new path of elder abuse. Also, as far as disadvantaged groups, Wanda says that, or seem to say that the older people with money aren't disadvantaged, but they are the people that are in the crosshairs of financial abuse. That's the most reported elder abuse. And also, I think you have to look at, there haven't been that many people, even now in Oregon, that use it. I haven't looked at the most recent stats, so I don't want to guess at a number, but it's not very large out of 10,000 deaths. But what it has done is it's just changed things. Like before, there was a big concern about people being unnecessarily treated, and you'd put in your power of attorney, or your advance directive, I don't want extraordinary treatment, and that was kind of what we would do when we would draft these documents. But now, because of our law being in place and this change I'm seeing by talking to caregivers that are on the ground, that doctors are making the choice and actually starting morphine against people's will or without people's consent. So now what I do is, if I draft a document for someone, we put in they want everything. Well, I did this specifically for a disabled woman. She was concerned that doctors would think she had no quality of life, and she was afraid that they would not treat her or would start the comfort care on her. And so for her, we put that she wanted everything. But she put her husband in charge and said, she didn't want everything, but she just wanted to slow it down. She wanted to get a chance. So I don't know if I answered your question.
Well, you said 2 minutes, so
Okay.
I guess you did. Ms. Morris, would you like to respond to that?
Sure. I think I've already responded to the point about elder abuse. We believe that people should have the rights to make choices, even though sometimes we might disagree with those choices. I think somebody that's being pressed into perhaps coerced towards aid in dying is just as likely to say, sod you, I'm not good. I was maybe thinking about it, I'm not going to do it, I'm going to go on for another 10 years just to spite you. But I'm pretty sure when Justice Opinka was writing the opinion for the majority in 1994, he wasn't thinking that he had to protect white, well-educated, well-off men. Margaret's mentioned a couple times the situation about people with disabilities and how they're opposed to choice in dying. And certainly there are some groups that speak for people with disabilities that are opposed. But in the Carter Challenge, there was a broad coalition of people with disabilities who spoke very forcefully for the legislation. And I think probably no one spoke more eloquently than Joe Arvey, who's the head litigator for BC Civil Liberties, and he said to deny disabled people choice is to infantilize them. And of course his words were so compelling because Joe comes into the courtroom in a wheelchair.
Okay, we have a question for Ms. Morris.
Thank you for your comments this evening. My question is for Ms. Morris. We have another organization in our midst that also deals with dignity for the dying. That's the hospice movement, and a beautiful facility in our community. And I was just wondering, Ms. Morris, have you ever debated or discussed the assisted suicide philosophy with representatives from the hospice movement in detail or in depth at any level? Because it seems like philosophically there's quite a conflict or contrast there.
It's a good question, and in fact, one of our former staff members and one of our key volunteers, one of our former staff members volunteered at hospice for many years, and one of our key volunteers, Dr. Greg Robinson, is a palliative care doctor. So we certainly have individuals that are supportive of us and very closely involved with palliative care. But in general, the viewpoint of palliative care is that we will neither prolong nor hasten a dying, which tends to conflict with us in that we believe people should have the choice to hasten. Where I have had the detailed discussions with individuals in hospice, what I have found, and it's very concerning, is that they have been given literature with lies in it. They have been given information that, when examined closely, contains statements that are simply not true. And we saw this very clearly in the Carter case, in the cross-examination of one of those academics for arguing for the Attorney General's case against legalizing choice. And repeatedly, over and over, he had to recant his testimony. He had to recant it because he had quoted sources that didn't support what he said, or in fact had made an opposite conclusion than the one that he stated. So I'm really grieved because I think many people in palliative care are making choices based on deep misinformation, and I would so much of what palliative care does overlaps with what we do. We just want to take it a little bit farther. Palliative care is absolutely critical, and we need to just offer choice as well.
Ms. Dore, you may respond if you wish.
Okay, it's kind of a, well, I would just talk about brochures. In Washington State, my friend's mother says that there are brochures from the dying people encouraging her to commit suicide at the senior center. So that gets her daughter upset. And also, intentionally killing someone goes a lot farther, because in palliative care, and actually there's an example of this in the terminal uncertainty article. With palliative care, say for example, you pull the plug on somebody. That doesn't mean they're necessarily going to die, you know. So, but if you kill them, well, they're dead. So, I appreciate good palliative care. I have unfortunately seen some things that I'm not very comfortable with in Washington. But anyway, I appreciate your work.
This will be our last question because we're just brushing up against the half hour. So this is a question from Ms. Dore. Anybody have a question? You have
Ms. Dore, with all the respect that I owe you, I see that you use very well thought words like compassion. But what the problem with that I see is that anybody that opposes that, by default, it's almost thought of immediately as being incompassionate. When in fact, we also fight for compassion for those that are dying that may have considered assisted suicide or some kind of early end to their suffering. But just because they consider it, they don't want to have their proper care taken away or have somebody else with a different interest than them. Their only interest is to finish their suffering earlier. And somebody else may see a different interest and try to end their life prior to that. We are trying to be compassionate and give them love for that. My question is, can you think of, for example, the peace of mind of those who have to assist legal lethal dose and how that plays in their psychology afterwards for the rest of their life, even if it's legal?
Could that be repeated for me?
I think the general question is what supports would be there for people who are the assisting members of society, the physicians, the family members who are carrying out the dose. Is that?
I don't know how to answer that.
Oh, I shouldn't be supposed to be Ms. Dore. Okay, we'll have to go for one more question. To be a question from Ms. Dore to wrap up here. Okay, down there.
I understand that you're fighting for the rights of people who don't want to die, but other people may make it seem like that dying is their choice. So I understand that it's very important to fight for their rights. But, on the other side, we have people who have rights, also rights to die. And we've talked about how suicide is legal. And it would be perfectly fine right now for me to walk out of here and kill myself, that's fine. But if I wasn't physically able to do so because of an illness, then what happens to my right to die? So you're fighting for the rights of one group of people, but what's the legal answer? How do you fight for the rights of one group of people, but ignore the rights of the other group? What's the legal answer to that?
Well, I'm just telling you how the laws work and what the consequences are. So how they work is they open new doors of abuse. In Oregon, they've allowed the Oregon health plan, the state health plan, to steer people to suicide. You also have this implicit steering to suicide. For example, it occurred with Jeanette Hall. Just because it's legal, she felt she should kill herself. No one was pushing her. Just the fact she voted for it. If you walked out and tried to kill yourself, I think some people here might try to stop you. Because there is suicide prevention is still a value in Canada. And
But it's legal.
well, yeah, you can't be sued for it. I mean, you're dead. You won't lose. You see what they used to do back in the Middle Ages or something. If someone committed suicide, they'd take away their estate and drag the body down the road or something. But then suicide was seen as more of a medical problem. That someone was, often people want to commit suicide. They're depressed or they've had, a bad grief or a disease or But usually it's psychological. I don't know. So I'm against this law. I want my choice. I can't opt out of it. I've seen people hurt by it. And they're just a really bad idea. And it seems to be leading to other things in Washington State. So I've heard of, more incidents of people being sedated without consent. Or, so.
Ms. Morris?
Thank you. That is the crux of the issue. We must protect the weak and vulnerable. We must make sure that nobody is coerced against their will. And we must balance their needs and their rights against those who suffer grievously at end of life and face the prospect of an unbearable death. I believe the studies show, the jurisdictions that have legalized choice in dying show that we can do both, that we can offer compassion and choice and protection. I would just say in closing that the earlier point that was brought up about our politicians and how they voted, sometimes a small minority can control, a small but vocal and well-organized minority can control a public agenda. If you are someone who believes in choice in dying and wants to support that, I encourage you to take action to do that. You can join Dying with Dignity. Our brochures contain a membership form. They're out on our table. Grab a newsletter, get informed. You can join online. You can join for as little as $10. That's our compassionate membership. Or if you're not ready to get that committed, sign up for our e-bulletin or simply like us on Facebook. Imagine if we had hundreds of thousands of people all having made a statement about their support for choice in dying. I think our voice would be unquenchable.
Please join me in thanking our participants. And that's it. There are tables outside, as you've been hearing, with material on there, and there's also a little donation box so you can help defer some of the costs of the auditorium and the rest of it. Thanks very much for coming.